Professor Bennett speaking, she answers, tucking a strand of graying-brown hair behind her ear. Eleanor, it's James. I finished the preliminary analysis you requested on that orphanage photograph. Dr. James Chen's voice sounds tinny through the receiver, but there's an undercurrent of excitement that catches her attention immediately. James Chen had been her colleague in the university's digital restoration department for 7 years now. A brilliant technician with an artist's eye for detail, he had pioneered several methods for recovering information from damaged historical photographs. Eleanor had sent him a high-resolution scan of the Whitechapel orphanage photograph 3 days ago, hoping his techniques might reveal details lost to time and the photograph's age. That was quick, she responds, glancing at her calendar where she'd noted he wasn't expected to complete the work until next week. What did you find? A pause on the line. Eleanor can hear the soft hum of machinery in the background, the ambient sounds of James's lab with its array of specialized equipment. When he speaks again, his voice has lowered, as if he's concerned about being overheard. You should come see for yourself. There's something, well, it's easier to show you. Are you free now? Eleanor checks her watch, an antique silver piece that had belonged to her grandmother, its hands showing just past 4 in the afternoon. I can be there in half an hour. Is everything all right, James? You sound troubled. I'm not sure, he admits, which is unusual for James. He's typically precise, methodical, confident in his assessments. I've never seen anything quite like this before. Not in all my years of digital restoration. Intrigued and slightly unsettled, Eleanor carefully returns the photograph to its protective acid-free sleeve and locks it in the archive's secure cabinet. She gathers her notebook, her tablet, and her coat. The October weather has turned chilly as evening approaches, and makes her way across the university campus toward the Science and Technology building where James's laboratory is housed. The walk gives her time to think, to organize her questions. What could James have found that would unsettle him so? Perhaps evidence of tampering with the original photograph. That wouldn't be unheard of. Early photography was rife with manipulations and double exposures, sometimes for artistic purposes, sometimes for more deceptive reasons. Or perhaps he'd uncovered some historical detail that changed the context of the image entirely. 30 minutes later, Eleanor stands beside James in his laboratory, staring at the high-resolution scan displayed on his computer screen. The lab is a stark contrast to her warm, paper-filled archive room, all gleaming surfaces, humming machines, and the blue-white glow of LED lighting. The smell of cleaning solution and electronics has replaced the comforting scent of old books and parchment. I started with basic enhancement, James explains, clicking through a series of processed images. His fingers move rapidly over the keyboard, bringing up version after version of the orphanage photograph. Contrast adjustment, detail recovery, repair of damaged areas, the usual protocol. But then I notice something odd in the background. Eleanor watches as the images progress, showing increasingly detailed versions of the photograph. The children's faces become clearer, the brickwork of the orphanage more defined, the subtle patterns in the girls' pinafores visible where before they had appeared as mere white shapes against darker dresses. There, James says, pointing to a window in the orphanage building behind the children. Do you see anything unusual? Eleanor leans closer, squinting slightly despite her glasses. The window he indicates, in the dim light of the university archives. Professor Eleanor Bennett adjusts her wire-rimmed glasses and leans closer to the weathered photograph. Rain taps gently against the tall windows of the archive room, casting wavering shadows across her workspace. The sepia-toned image before her shows 37 children arranged in 3 neat rows outside a formidable Victorian brick building. Their solemn faces stare back at her across the span of 121 years, frozen in a moment from another century. The Whitechapel Orphanage, East London, June 1904, Eleanor murmurs, reading the faded copperplate inscription on the back, donated by the Harrington estate. Her fingertips trace the slight indentations where someone had pressed hard with a fountain pen all those decades ago. The photograph had arrived last week among a collection of historical documents from one of London's wealthiest families, ledgers bound in cracked leather, correspondence on yellowed stationery, newspaper clippings preserved between sheets of wax paper. Nothing about this particular photograph seemed remarkable at first glance. Just another institutional image from the early 20th century, one of countless such photographs taken to document the era's charitable endeavors. But something about the children's expressions had caught Eleanor's attention during her initial cataloging. There was a tension in their posture, a wariness in their eyes that seemed unusual. She had set it aside at first, focusing on the more obviously valuable documents in the collection. Yet she found herself returning to it today, drawn by some indefinable quality she couldn't quite articulate. The children wore the standard orphanage uniforms of the period. Boys in short trousers and jackets with stiff collars, girls in plain pinafores over long-sleeved dresses. Their hair was neatly combed, shoes polished, everything as would be expected for a formal photograph in 1904. But their eyes. Eleanor had worked as a specialist in historical photography and child welfare history for 15 years. She had examined hundreds of similar images from workhouses, orphanages, and children's homes across Britain. Orphanage photographs were common during that era, a way to document the institution's charitable work, to satisfy benefactors, and sometimes to help place children with families or employers. But this one felt different. The typical solemn expressions of Victorian and Edwardian photographs were present, of course. Smiling for photographs wasn't customary until later in the century. Yet there was something beyond solemnity in these children's faces, something that made the fine hairs on Eleanor's arms stand on end, despite the warmth of the archive room. She retrieves a magnifying glass from her desk drawer and begins to examine the children's faces more closely, row by row. In the back row, a tall boy with hollow cheeks stares not at the camera but slightly to the left, his eyes widened as if in alarm. Beside him, a girl of perhaps 13 clutches the hand of a smaller child so tightly that her knuckles appear white against the dark fabric of her dress. Eleanor's office phone rings, startling her from her thoughts. The shrill sound seems almost jarringly modern in the hushed atmosphere of the archives, where she had been slipping imperceptibly into thoughts of the past. Professor Bennett speaking. "Eleanor, it's James. I've finished the preliminary analysis you requested on that orphanage photograph." Dr. James Chen, her colleague in the university's digital restoration department, had been helping her examine the photograph using their newest imaging technology. "That was quick. What did you find?" A pause on the line. "You should come see for yourself. There's something, well, it's easier to show you." 30 minutes later, Eleanor stands beside James in his laboratory, staring at the high-resolution scan displayed on his computer screen. "I started with basic enhancement," James explains, clicking through a series of processed images. Contrast adjustment, detail recovery, the usual. But then I noticed something odd in the background. He zooms in on a window in the orphanage building behind the children. The glass is mostly reflective, showing only the vague outline of the room inside. But as James enhances the image further, adjusting the contrast and sharpness, something begins to emerge from the darkness. "Do you see it?" James asks, his voice hushed. Eleanor leans closer, squinting. Within the window, barely visible but unmistakably there, is a face. Not a child's face, but something wrong. The proportions seem distorted, the features blurred as if caught in motion. But there's an intensity to the eyes that sends a chill down Eleanor's spine. "What am I looking at, James?" "I don't know. At first I thought it might be a photographic anomaly or damage to the original. But look at this." He zooms in further, enhancing just the window area. The face appears to be looking directly at the camera. And more importantly, it doesn't match any of the adults visible elsewhere in the photograph. Eleanor studies the image. Could it be a double exposure? Those weren't uncommon in early photography. That was my first thought too. But the rest of the image is perfectly clear. And look at the children in the front row. James zooms out and then focuses on the faces of 3 children standing in the front. Their expressions, more visible now with the enhanced clarity, show something beyond the usual solemnity of historical photographs. There's fear in their eyes, and they're all looking slightly to the left of the camera, in the direction of the window. "I've never seen anything quite like this," Eleanor admits. The photographer was using a relatively advanced camera for 1904. The exposure time would have been quick enough that the children wouldn't have had to hold their poses for more than a second or two. Whatever they were reacting to was happening in that moment. James nods. "There's something else. I found a database record of the Whitechapel orphanage. It burned down in December 1904, just 6 months after this photograph was taken. 27 children and 3 staff members died in the fire. The revelation hangs in the air between them." Eleanor feels a deep unease settling over her, the kind that comes from brushing against a long-buried tragedy. "I want to know more about this place," she says finally, "and about the Harrington family that donated the photograph. There might be more to this story than we can see." Over the next week, Eleanor dives deep into research. The Whitechapel orphanage, she discovers, was established in 1887 by industrialist William Harrington as part of his philanthropic works. The institution housed up to 50 children at a time, primarily those orphaned by accidents in London's factories and workhouses, many of which were owned by Harrington himself. The fire that destroyed the orphanage was attributed to faulty wiring, though newspaper accounts from the time hinted at irregularities in the investigation. Several articles mentioned unusual circumstances, without elaborating further. Eleanor is in the university library's rare book room, poring over microfiche copies of the East London Observer from December 1904, when her phone buzzes with a text from James. "Found something. Come to the lab, now." This time, James isn't alone. With him is Dr. Sarah Okafor, a professor of folklore and supernatural studies whose work often intersects with historical research. "I hope you don't mind," James says as Eleanor enters. "I showed Sarah the photograph. Given her expertise, I thought she might have some insights." Eleanor raises an eyebrow but nods a greeting to Sarah. Though they've served on committees together, Eleanor has always kept a professional distance from Sarah's department, which some in the university consider to be on the fringes of serious academic inquiry. "What have you found?" Eleanor asks, looking at the large screen where the photograph is once again displayed. James clicks his keyboard, and the image shifts to an extreme close-up of the back row of children. "I was going through each face methodically, looking for any other anomalies, and then I noticed this." He points to a girl standing at the end of the row. Unlike the other children, whose gaze is directed either at the camera or toward the window, this child is looking directly at the mysterious face in the window, and she's smiling. "That's unusual in itself," Eleanor notes. Children rarely smiled in formal photographs of this era. It wasn't customary. "Look closer at her hand," Sarah says quietly. James zooms in further. The girl's right hand is partially raised, her fingers curled in what might be a wave, or perhaps a gesture of beckoning. "Her name was Emily Winters," James says, age 12 at the time of the photograph. According to the orphanage records, she was one of the children who perished in the fire. Sarah steps forward. "The gesture she's making isn't random. It's similar to signs found in certain folk practices of the period, particularly those associated with communing with spirits or entities beyond the veil." Eleanor feels her scientific skepticism rising. "That seems speculative." "Perhaps," Sarah concedes. "But consider this. I cross-referenced the orphanage records with census data and newspaper accounts. Before coming to the orphanage, Emily Winters lived with her grandmother, who was rumored to be a practitioner of folk magic in the East End. The grandmother was committed to Bethlehem Royal Hospital, Bedlam, after claiming that she and the child had made contact with something from the other side." James looks uncomfortable. "That's not all. I've been doing more detailed analysis of the window image." He pulls up another enhanced section of the photograph. "Using spectral analysis, I can detect variations in the photographic emulsion that suggest the image in the window may have been added after the original photograph was taken." "A manipulation?" Eleanor asks, feeling a mix of relief and disappointment. "So someone doctored the photograph?" "Not exactly," James says. "The alterations appear to be contemporary with the original development process, as if something manifested on the negative during development." Sarah nods as if this confirms something. There are accounts in folklore of spirits or entities appearing in photographs, particularly around individuals who are sensitive to such phenomena, or who have attempted to make contact. Eleanor isn't ready to entertain supernatural explanations, but she can't deny the growing strangeness of what they've discovered. "Let's stick to verifiable facts. We have a photograph from an orphanage that later burned down under questionable circumstances. We have a child with a possible connection to folk practices making an unusual gesture, and we have some kind of anomaly in the image that appears to be contemporary with its creation." "There's one more thing," James says, looking troubled. "I found a journal article from 1905 written by the fire inspector who investigated the Whitechapel tragedy. It was published in an obscure technical journal after he was removed from his position with the London Fire Brigade. In it, he claims that the fire started in multiple locations simultaneously, and that several witnesses, staff members who survived, reported seeing a dark figure moving through the halls just before the flames erupted." The three academics look at each other in silence for a moment. "I need to see the original photograph again," Eleanor says finally. Back in the archives, Eleanor carefully removes the photograph from its protective sleeve. Under the bright light of her examination lamp, she studies it with a magnifying glass, looking for any details they might have missed in the digital scan. The edges of the photograph are slightly singed, she realizes, a detail she hadn't noticed before, as if it had been rescued from a fire. Turning it over, she examines the back more carefully. Beyond the inscription she'd read earlier, there's another note written in faint pencil in the corner. The children see it. God help them. God help us all. Eleanor's hands tremble slightly as she places the photograph down. James, Sarah, I think we need to learn more about the Harrington family. Their connection to this orphanage goes beyond simple philanthropy. Their research into the Harrington family leads them to discover that the current heir is a man named Richard Harrington, now in his 70s and living in relative seclusion in a converted lighthouse on the Suffolk coast. After several emails and phone calls that go unanswered, Eleanor finally receives a brief response to a handwritten letter she'd sent as a last resort. I will see you. Come alone. Tuesday next, 2 p.m. The journey to Suffolk takes Eleanor nearly 3 hours by train and then taxi, the landscape gradually shifting from London's urban sprawl to flat, windswept coastline. The October weather has turned blustery, with dark clouds gathering over the steel-gray North Sea as her taxi bumps along the narrow coastal road. The lighthouse is a stark white tower against the threatening sky when Eleanor arrives. A Victorian structure that has been modernized with large windows cut into its thick walls. A stone cottage adjoins it, smoke curling from its chimney, the only sign of habitation in this isolated spot where land meets the restless sea. Richard Harrington greets her at the door, tall and gaunt, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes that seem to evaluate her thoroughly before he invites her inside. His face is deeply lined, but she can see traces of the aristocratic features visible in the photographs of his great-grandfather William. Few people ask about the Whitechapel orphanage these days, he says as he leads her up a spiral staircase to a circular room at the top of the lighthouse. The space has been converted into a study, lined with bookshelves and furnished with antiques that speak of faded wealth. Large windows provide a panoramic view of the churning sea below. My family has worked hard to put that unfortunate chapter behind us. I'm interested in the photograph taken in June 1904, Eleanor explains, setting her laptop on a heavy oak table. The wind howls around the lighthouse, making the windows rattle in their frames. It came to our university with some other documents donated by your family's estate. Richard's expression tightens, the lines around his mouth deepening. I thought all of those had been destroyed. This one survived, Eleanor says, opening her laptop to show him the digital scan. We've been studying it, and we've found some unusual elements. Richard doesn't look at the screen. Instead, he walks to a window overlooking the turbulent North Sea. His tall figure is silhouetted against the gray light, shoulders slightly stooped with age, but still carrying the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. My great-grandfather, William Harrington, was not the philanthropist history remembers him as, he says after a long silence. The orphanage was not his attempt at charity, but at atonement. Eleanor waits, sensing that Richard needs to tell this story in his own way. The room is cool despite the fire burning in a small iron stove in the corner, and she keeps her coat on, feeling a chill that seems to come as much from Richard's words as from the weather. William made his fortune in manufacturing, textile mills, ironworks, chemical plants. But his factories were death traps. Hundreds of workers died over the years, crushed by machinery, poisoned by chemicals, trapped in fires, including the parents of many of the children who ended up at Whitechapel. Richard runs a hand through his white hair, disturbing its careful arrangement. But that was only part of his sin. He turns back to face Eleanor, his expression grave. He was also deeply involved in occult practices, not the drawing room seances that were fashionable in Victorian society, but something darker, something that had roots in much older, more dangerous traditions. Eleanor thinks of Emily Winters and her grandmother, the folk practitioner. What kind of practices? Richard moves to a bookshelf and removes an old leather-bound volume, its cover unmarked. There was a group of industrialists who believed they could harness supernatural forces to increase their wealth and power. They called themselves the Covenant of the Veil. William was one of the founding members. Eleanor feels a jolt of recognition at the name. I found a photograph, she says. Men standing before a fireplace, with a symbol, an eye with rays extending outward. Richard nods, unsurprised. Their emblem, representing the eye that sees beyond the veil of ordinary reality. He opens the book, revealing pages of handwritten text interspersed with disturbing diagrams. They performed rituals, made sacrifices, not human, at least not directly, but they would deliberately create conditions where accidents were likely, then harvest the... Richard pauses, seeming to search for words. The energy, the fear and suffering. Despite her academic skepticism, Eleanor feels a chill run through her. The wind outside has increased, throwing the first drops of rain against the windows with sudden violence. And the orphanage? A repository, a collection point. Richard's voice has taken on a distant quality, as if he's reciting something memorized long ago. All those children who had lost their parents to the factories, they were particularly sensitive to the energies the Covenant was manipulating. Children are more attuned to the unseen world in general, and these orphans, marked by tragedy, even more so. William believed they could serve as conduits. Eleanor thinks of the children's faces in the photograph, their fearful expressions now contextualized in a way that makes her stomach turn. What went wrong? Richard laughs bitterly, the sound sharp and sudden in the quiet room. Everything. The entity they contacted couldn't be controlled. It began manifesting in the orphanage, terrifying the children. They saw it first, in the walls, at windows, moving through hallways at night. The staff dismissed it as nightmares, as childish imagination, until they began to see it too. He closes the book and returns it carefully to its shelf, except for one child, a girl who had some knowledge of the old ways through her grandmother. She wasn't afraid. She thought she could communicate with it, perhaps even control it. "Emily Winters," Eleanor says softly. Richard looks surprised, his eyebrows rising. "Yes. How did you know?" Eleanor turns her laptop to show him the enhanced image of Emily, her hand raised in that strange gesture, her smile directed at the distorted face in the window. Richard stares at the screen, his face paling beneath its weathered tan. He reaches out one hand as if to touch the image, then draws back before making contact. "She made a pact with it," he says, his voice barely above a whisper now. "She promised it freedom in exchange for power. Power over the other children, over the staff, over her own fate. But such entities don't honor human bargains. When it broke free, it took her and many others with it." "The fire," Eleanor says, understanding dawning. Richard nods, returning to his position by the window. Outside, the storm has fully arrived, rain lashing against the glass in wind-driven sheets. The fire was no accident. It was a manifestation, a doorway. My great-grandfather was there that night, conducting what he thought would be another ritual to channel energy. He survived, but what he witnessed broke him. He spent the rest of his life trying to contain the damage, to seal what had been opened. Eleanor gestures to the photograph displayed on her computer screen. "And this? Why preserve it? A warning, perhaps. A reminder. Each generation of our family has been tasked with keeping watch, making sure the door remains closed." Richard finally looks directly at the image again, at the distorted face in the window. But doors can be reopened, especially when people go looking for them without understanding what's on the other side. His words hang in the air between them, heavy with implication. Thunder rumbles in the distance, as if underscoring his warning. "What exactly are you saying, Mr. Harrington?" "I'm saying that by studying this photograph, by enhancing it, focusing on it, you may have drawn attention." Richard's voice takes on an urgency that belies his age. "The entity exists in a state between worlds. It perceives things differently than we do. Time is not linear for it. Your interest now can affect its actions then." Eleanor wants to dismiss his warnings as superstition, the ramblings of an old man burdened by family guilt. But something stops her. The burned edges of the photograph, the fear in the children's eyes, the face in the window that shouldn't be there, and her own unease, growing stronger since she first laid eyes on the photograph, that sense of something watching from just beyond the corner of her vision. "What would you have me do? Destroy the photograph?" Richard shakes his head, moving to sit in a worn leather chair beside the iron stove. "It's too late for that. It's been seen, studied, digitized. The connection has been made." He gestures to the bookshelves surrounding them. "My family has collected knowledge as a form of protection, ways to recognize the signs, to prevent another breach." He walks to a different bookshelf and retrieves another old leather-bound volume, this one with a silver clasp that he opens with a small key from his pocket. This journal belonged to a member of the Covenant who turned against their practices. It contains rituals of containment, ways to close doors that have been opened. As Eleanor reaches for the book, her phone buzzes with a text. The screen lights up with a message from James. "Something's happening with the digital file. Image changing. Come back now." Eleanor shows Richard the message. His face grows grave, the last color draining from it. "It's beginning," he says, his voice suddenly strong and commanding. "We need to hurry." "I don't understand," Eleanor begins, but Richard cuts her off, taking the book and moving toward the stairs. "There's no time to explain further. If your colleague has been working with the enhanced image, focusing on it, He may have provided the energy it needs to strengthen its connection to our time. Oh, the drive back to London is tense and hazardous through the storm. With Richard sitting silently in the passenger seat of the rental car Eleanor had arranged when the local taxi refused to take them all the way to the city. The ancient journal is clutched in Richard's hands, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. As they navigate the rain-slicked roads, Eleanor's phone rings. It's Sarah, her voice tight with concern. "Eleanor, where are you? Something's wrong with him. He locked himself in the lab after sending you that text. He's not responding to anyone." "What do you mean, wrong with him?" Eleanor asks, keeping her eyes on the road as she navigates around a fallen branch. "He was working on the photograph all morning," Sarah explains. "I stopped by around noon to see if he'd found anything new. He seemed fine then, but distracted. Said he was seeing details he'd missed before. Then about an hour ago, someone heard a crash from his lab. When they knocked, he told them to go away, that he was working. But his voice sounded strange." Richard motions for Eleanor to give him the phone. When she does, he speaks rapidly to Sarah. "Listen carefully. Don't try to enter the lab. Don't let anyone else in either. And most importantly, make sure no one else views the photograph. Not on screens, not printouts, nothing. Do you understand?" Eleanor can't hear Sarah's response, but Richard seems satisfied with it. He returns the phone, his expression grim. "We need to hurry," he repeats. "Your friend is in danger." By the time Eleanor and Richard arrive at the digital restoration lab, the storm has followed them to London, rain pounding against the university's Gothic buildings and turning the normally busy campus into a deserted landscape of puddles and bent trees. Campus security has already forced the door open at Sarah's insistence, though they'd been reluctant to do so without a clear emergency. James sits rigidly before his computer, staring at the screen where the orphanage photograph is displayed. But the image has changed. The face in the window is clearer now, its features more defined. A twisted, hungry visage that seems to stare out of the screen with malevolent awareness. The background of the photograph has darkened, the sunny day of the original replaced by an ominous twilight. And most disturbing of all, the entity's form is no longer confined to the window. Shadowy tendrils extend outward, reaching toward the children in the front row. James himself is unresponsive, his eyes fixed on the screen, his expression a mirror of the fearful children in the photograph. Except for his right hand, which is raised in the same gesture as Emily Winter's, fingers curled in that beckoning motion. "Don't touch him," Richard warns sharply as Eleanor moves toward her colleague. The connection has been established. Sarah stands nearby, her academic skepticism visibly shaken. Her hands twist nervously in the fabric of her scarf, a bright splash of color in the sterile lab environment. "His computer has been sending emails," she tells them, "to everyone who's viewed the enhanced image." Attaching the file. 7 people have already opened it. Richard opens the journal, flipping through pages of handwritten text and diagrams with practiced familiarity. "We need to sever the connection before it spreads further. The entity feeds on attention. The more people who see it, focus on it, the stronger it becomes in our world." Eleanor looks at James, at his fixed stare and rigid posture. His skin has taken on an unnatural pallor, and his breathing is shallow and too regular, as if he's in some kind of trance. "What about him? How do we help him?" "First we contain the spread," Richard says firmly. "Then we can try to free those already caught." With Sarah's help, they begin gathering the materials Richard's journal specifies for the containment ritual. Salt, iron filings, certain herbs that Sarah, with her background in anthropology and folk practices, is able to source from the university's botanical collection, and most importantly, silver nitrate, a compound used in early photographic development that James's lab has in stock. As they work, the building's lights begin to flicker, the storm outside intensifying. One of the technicians from down the hall enters, his face pale. "What's going on?" "I opened an email from Dr. Chen and now my computer is showing this weird old photo." Richard moves quickly, closing the journal. "Show me your screen, now." They follow the technician to his office where the orphanage photograph glows on his monitor. But this version is different still. The entity's face is no longer confined to the window. It appears to be emerging, a shadowy form now visible behind the children in the front row, its elongated limbs reaching around them as if in a possessive embrace. And the technician's right hand is beginning to rise, fingers curling. "It's spreading faster than I feared," Richard says, his voice tight with urgency. "The digital medium removes barriers that would have contained it in 1904. We need to implement the containment immediately." Back in the lab, they prepare the ritual components according to Richard's instructions. Sarah, despite her academic study of folklore, looks uncertain as she arranges the salt in a circle around James and his computer. "This goes against everything in my scientific training," Eleanor admits as she helps measure precise amounts of iron filings into small dishes. "Science has its limits," Richard replies, his hands steady as he mixes the silver nitrate solution. "My great-grandfather and his colleagues thought they could approach the supernatural with industrial precision, bend it to their will. They learned too late that some forces operate by their own rules. As they complete the preparations, the building's electricity cuts out entirely, plunging them into darkness. Emergency lights cast a dim glow over the scene. James hasn't moved, his eyes still fixed on the now darkened screen. "It knows," Richard says, his voice low but steady. "It's trying to stop us." In the dim light, Eleanor notices something alarming, a faint glow coming from the computer screen despite the power outage. The photograph is still visible, and the entity's form is more substantial now. No longer just a face or reaching tendrils, but a looming presence that seems to fill the frame. The children in the image appear to be shrinking back, their expressions of fear more pronounced than in the original. Richard begins the ritual, reading from the journal in a steady voice. The words are in Latin, interspersed with phrases in what sounds to Eleanor like Old English, or perhaps Welsh. As he speaks, Sarah sprinkles the silver nitrate solution onto the salt circle, which begins to emit a faint bluish luminescence. Nothing happens at first. Then, slowly, James begins to tremble. On the screen, the image flickers, not like a digital glitch, but like a film being run backward and forward rapidly. The entity's form wavers, sometimes advancing, sometimes receding. "It's resisting," Richard says between phrases, his forehead beaded with sweat despite the chill in the room. "We need something more, a personal connection, someone who can reach James." Eleanor steps forward, careful not to disturb the salt circle. "James and I have worked together for 7 years. We're friends as well as colleagues." Richard nods. "Speak to him. Remind him of his connections to this world this time. The entity exists between moments. It can only fully manifest when someone surrenders their place in the present." Eleanor kneels beside James, keeping herself just outside the salt circle. "James, it's Eleanor. I need you to focus on my voice. Remember the conference in Edinburgh last year? How we got lost in the old town and ended up finding that amazing little bookshop where you bought that first edition of Strand magazine?" No response. James continues to stare at the screen, his hand still raised in that beckoning gesture. "Remember your niece's graduation 2 months ago? You showed me the pictures. How proud you were of her getting her medical degree. You're supposed to visit her in Manchester next weekend." As she speaks, James's rigid posture begins to soften slightly. On the screen, the entity's form becomes less distinct, wavering like smoke in wind. "Keep going," Richard urges, continuing the ritual words. The silver-infused salt glows more brightly now, casting eerie blue shadows across the lab. Eleanor places her hand near James's, not touching, but close. "Remember the project we're planning for next semester? The exhibition on Victorian child welfare? I need your expertise, James. I need you here, now." James blinks for the first time since they entered the room. His raised hand trembles and begins to lower. On the screen, the entity's form contorts, seeming to reach out toward them. The image of the orphanage behind it flickers, briefly showing not the sunny June day of the original photograph, but a building engulfed in flames. The children's solemn faces transform into expressions of terror. Richard's voice grows stronger, the ritual words coming faster. Sarah completes the circle with the last of the silver nitrate solution, which begins to emit a faint bluish glow, the same color as the chemical's reaction in early photographic development processes. A high-pitched whine emerges from the computer speakers, rising in volume until it's almost painful. The lights in the lab flicker rapidly, emergency systems struggling against some force that seems to be drawing power from the building itself. James gasps suddenly like a swimmer breaking the surface after too long underwater. He slumps forward and Eleanor catches him before he can fall. On the screen, the photograph returns to its original state. The children posed in their rows, the barely perceptible face in the window once again faint and contained. "Did it work?" Sarah asks, looking from James to the screen, her voice betraying both scientific doubt and hopeful belief. Richard closes the journal, his hands shaking slightly with exhaustion. "Partially. We've prevented it from spreading further through the digital copies. But the original photograph, and anyone who has directly handled it, will still carry the connection. Eleanor helps James to a chair. He's disoriented but conscious, his eyes blinking rapidly, as if adjusting to the light. "What happened?" he asks, his voice hoarse as if from screaming, though he made no sound during the ordeal. I was in a dark place. There was something with me, something that wanted to wear me, somehow. Later, Eleanor tells him gently, squeezing his shoulder. "Rest now." The emergency lights flicker, and suddenly the regular power returns. Computer screens throughout the lab light up, but the image of the orphanage photograph has disappeared from James's monitor, replaced by his normal desktop. Richard looks exhausted but relieved, the lines in his face deeper than before. The containment is holding, but we need to deal with the original photograph, and any copies that have already been distributed. "What did I see?" James asks, more insistent now as his strength returns. He runs a hand through his disheveled hair, his eyes still haunted. "It was like I was there, at the orphanage, but not the day of the photograph, the night of the fire. There were children screaming and something moving through the halls, something that shouldn't exist." Eleanor and Sarah exchange concerned glances. "You were caught in some kind of connection," Eleanor explains carefully. "The entity in the photograph somehow affected you through your work on the digital image. Not just an effect," Richard corrects, lowering himself wearily into a chair. "A reaching through. Time isn't linear for it. It exists in the moment of the photograph, and in every moment the photograph exists. When someone focuses on it with enough intensity, especially using technology to enhance and examine it, they create a bridge." James looks at his computer screen, now showing harmless icons and documents. "I sent emails. I don't remember doing it, but I know I did, with the image attached. We need to track down everyone who received those emails," Richard says, "and anyone who opened them." In the days that follow, they work methodically to contain the spread. Most of the email recipients hadn't opened the attachment yet, and those who had experienced only mild effects, a sense of unease, disturbing dreams, a compulsion to keep looking at the image. None had fallen into the trance-like state that had gripped James, perhaps because they hadn't studied the image with the same intense focus. The original photograph is sealed according to Richard's instructions, placed in a box lined with salt and iron filings, wrapped in cloth soaked in silver nitrate, and locked away in the university's most secure storage facility. A week later, Eleanor, James, Sarah, and Richard meet in Eleanor's office. The October storm has passed, leaving behind clear, cold days and nights where stars shine with crystalline brilliance. James has recovered fully, though he admits to nightmares about fire and a lurking presence that he can never quite see directly. "I've been researching the Covenant of the Veil," Sarah says, setting a stack of notes on Eleanor's desk. There are references to it in several obscure occult texts and private correspondence from the period. They were active from approximately 1870 to 1910, primarily in industrial cities across Britain. Their practices combined elements of ceremonial magic with certain industrial processes, using factory machinery in rituals, incorporating chemical compounds developed for manufacturing. A perversion of both spiritual and scientific principles, Richard says, looking older and more frail in the daylight than he had during the intensity of the containment ritual. "My family has spent generations trying to undo the damage they caused. The question remains," Eleanor says, tapping her pen against a legal pad covered in her neat handwriting. "What exactly did they contact? What is the entity in the photograph?" Richard shakes his head, the movement slow and deliberate. "The journal doesn't name it specifically. It refers to it only as that which waits between, a force or being that exists in the liminal spaces, between worlds, between moments in time. The Covenant believed they could control it, use it to manipulate probabilities in their favor, ensure accidents in competitors' factories while preventing them in their own, influence investments, politicians, rivals. But it turned on them," James says. "It's not a question. Yes, starting with the orphanage. The children were meant to be conduits. Their traumatic experiences, having lost parents to industrial accidents, created a particular sensitivity that the Covenant sought to exploit. But Emily Winters changed the equation. Her grandmother had taught her older forms of folk magic, protective in nature, but when applied to the Covenant's ritual framework, it created an unexpected pathway." Eleanor thinks of the girl's smile in the photograph, her beckoning gesture. She invited it in, not understanding what it truly was. Richard confirms. A 12-year-old girl who had lost everything, offered power by something that seemed to recognize her when the world had forgotten her. The implications settle heavily on them all. The tragedy of the orphanage fire takes on new dimensions. Not just a disaster, but a violent incursion. Children and staff caught in a conflict between forces they couldn't comprehend. "Is it over?" James asks finally. "Have we contained it?" Richard looks troubled, his pale blue eyes distant. "For now. But such entities are patient. The original photograph still exists, and knowledge of it has spread. Stories have power. The telling of this event, even in careful academic terms, keeps a thread of connection alive. So what do we do?" Eleanor asks. "Pretend it never happened? Bury the research?" "No," Richard says, a new firmness in his voice. "That approach failed for the Covenant members who survived. My great-grandfather's generation tried to erase all records, destroy all evidence. But suppression only created more vulnerable points where the truth could break through unexpectedly, without context or protection. So instead, we document it," Sarah suggests, leaning forward in her chair. "But carefully, creating a record that warns rather than invites." Eleanor nods slowly, understanding dawning. "A case study in historical photography analysis, technical details about the enhancement process, cultural context about orphanages and child welfare in Edwardian London, but nothing that would encourage others to seek out the original or recreate our exact methods of examination. A protective scholarly barrier," James adds, the term coming to him naturally. "Information without invitation." Richard seems to approve, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "My family has tried isolation for generations. Perhaps a new approach is needed. But be careful. The entity perceives attention. Focus and intent matter more than physical proximity." As their meeting concludes, Eleanor finds herself alone in her office with the afternoon light casting long shadows across her desk. She opens her computer to begin drafting their case study, carefully choosing which details to include and which to omit. A notification pops up, an email from the university archives confirming that the Harrington collection materials have been properly secured, according to the special handling instructions she provided. Eleanor pauses, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The entity in the photograph had latched onto James because of his intense focus on the image, his work to enhance and reveal its secrets. Now she will be focusing on it again, in a different way, through words rather than images, through context rather than direct examination. She thinks of Emily Winters, a child seeking connection and power in a world that had taken everything from her, of the other orphans whose fear was captured in that single photographic moment, of the scholars and specialists who would read the case study she's about to write, approaching it with academic interest rather than understanding the true nature of what they were learning about. "A protective scholarly barrier," she murmurs, echoing James's words. "But will it be enough?" Eleanor begins to type, weighing each word carefully. This is not just documentation, but a kind of containment in itself, a way of acknowledging the truth while creating boundaries around it. The entity feeds on focus and fear. Perhaps a clinical measured approach can create a different kind of energy, one that illuminates without inviting. As the words appear on her screen, Eleanor makes a silent promise to the children of Whitechapel Orphanage, to Emily Winters, even to William Harrington and his descendants. She will tell their story, but in doing so, she will also help ensure that the door remains closed. The last light of day fades from her office window as she works, the modern world continuing around her. Cars passing on the street below, students crossing the campus quad, a plane tracing its path across the darkening sky, all unaware of what exists in the spaces between moments, in the liminal realm where past and present blur, where an entity waits for someone to look too closely, to reach too far into the shadows of history. Eleanor glances up from her screen, suddenly aware of how dark her office has become. She reaches for the lamp on her desk, but pauses as a reflection catches her eye, her own face in the window glass, superimposed over the night beyond. For an instant, it seems as if someone else is looking back at her, a distorted visage with hungry eyes. She blinks, and it's gone, just her own tired reflection. Eleanor turns on the lamp, dispelling the illusion with warm light. She returns to her work, choosing her next words with care. The story must be told, but some details will remain in shadow, a necessary precaution in a world where old photographs can hold more than memories, where specialists studying the past must be careful not to invite it into the present. Outside, the night deepens. Inside, words form a barrier against the dark, imperfect but intentional, a scholarly shield against that which waits between. The specialists who studied the 1904 orphan photograph found something no one expected. But perhaps the most important discovery was knowing when to look away, when to close the file, when to let some secrets remain just beyond focus, visible enough to warn, but distant enough to contain. In her office, Eleanor Bennett continues to write, the lamplight steady around her, keeping the shadows at bay for another night.